So here's the book. Great title. Pass it around. If you like. I'm a media studies researcher, basically. And I've lived in Vermont a long time, though, so I have a personal experience with some of this story. I've worked in the electric utility business. I've worked for the state regulators. I've worked as an activist. I grew up in Putney, 12 miles from the plant. And I wrote a couple academic articles about this, using this media studies approach. But then I really wanted to write something that was like accessible, and that the story itself was interesting, rather than telling people that the story is interesting. Hey! So I had my summer off. First time I actually had a summer off in 2010. And so I started taking the research that I had been doing and thinking about how I would make it into the whole thing into one story. And then again, I had the summer of 2011 off. And so I basically spent all summer, that's this past summer, trying to take all these various threads I had to turn it into one story. And then I was really, really lucky, because this is not, I don't have a professional editor per se on this book, but Stephanie Kaza, who's the director of the environmental program, is a really, really good, she's Aaron's thesis advisor, really, really good editor and writer, and she was willing to spend a lot of time, and she made the book so much better, what a professional editor might have done. You know, when I would get off track and, I don't know, try and be a bit too smart or clever or something, she was able to just kind of keep me back to some some key themes that this really becomes a story of. So this is the story of the book, and then I'm going to do a little bit of the key parts of the book. But the story was unfolding, right? It's a story that keeps breaking. And so over the Christmas holidays, I rewrote the last chapter to try and be as relevant as possible, praying that there wouldn't be any more news breaking. And in that time period, just at the end of Christmas vacation, the federal judge announced his ruling, and so I kind of end the book with that ruling. Although I had a sense, I had a tip that the Attorney General, that the state would probably appeal the federal district judge's decision, and so I kind of was able to signpost that. So the three themes in using, I'm grounded, this book is grounded in the idea of storytelling, that humans are storytellers, and that we make sense, we understand the world through the stories we hear and the stories we tell. News reporters are also storytellers. And what I was interested in trying to understand is through the stories that the news media wrote about Vermont Yankee, is there a way to understand what happened that this asset that's been a part of our electric infrastructure system since 1972, so a third of the electricity, Burlington's a little different, but in general, in the state, a third of the electricity that flows through down to the consumers and businesses since 1972 has come from this nuclear power plant over 150 miles from where we sit. So what happened between 2002, when this out-of-state company bought the plant from these Vermont utilities, and 2010, when the Vermont legislature rejected the plant? And it was a very unusual thing that happened. There hadn't been a public vote on a nuclear power plant since more than 20 years. So what happened between, and when Entergy bought the plant, everybody, and political leaders in Vermont and legislators and the electric utilities welcomed this professional nuclear power plant manager to the scene. And something happened between 2002 and 2010. And so I gathered 1,400 news stories from 5 different sources and tried to see if there's something in how the story was told that can help explain that policy outcome. And what I argue in here is that there's 2 competing stories about Vermont Yankee. One story is that it's this tremendous economic asset to the state, 640 well-paid jobs, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of property taxes and local investments and state payroll taxes and reliable, low-cost electricity. So that's one story. You can guess what the story that's told by the opposition, and that is that this is an aging, unreliable nuclear power plant mismanaged by an untrustworthy, out-of-state corporation for their own profits. So you have these two stories, and somewhere in there, this story took on more credibility. And so I take three incidences, the three events that happened at the plant over this 10-year period. What are they? Those who know don't say, but if those of you who've kind of followed the story.
The rods, the missing rods.
The missing fuel rods, good guess, but Bob?
Well, you're not talking about external factors like Fukushima?
No, and actually Fukushima happened after the legislative voted on this. So I'm really focused on the case studies 2002, when the sale was finalized, to 2010, when the Vermont Senate voted 26-4 to basically shutter this nuclear power plant. So those of you who have lived around here, and so one of my data sources, yes, I had the media articles, but I also did maybe 30 interviews over the summer and asked everybody that I interviewed that question.
The photograph of the collapsed wall.
The cooling tower.
The tritium in the water?
Tritium in the water, cooling tower, okay. That's two, or three anyway, because we have and I chose three, and each of these three illustrates the change in stores. What's another one? Any other guesses?
Aren't they short on the decommissioning funds?
Right, so that could be one, certainly.
Then it's the same model as the one that had a meltdown in Japan?
Yeah, but again, that happened after.
Oh, right.
Fukushima is 2011.
Were there strontium issues too? Was found outside the plant in water and biota.
Matt?
When you have the water temperature issue coming out of into the.
So that could be one, certainly.
How about waste storage?
Waste storage could be one. You can see how difficult it is. I just have enormous respect for people who can take all these things and write a book out of it, even a short book like this. But so yes, those are all ones. Any others?
They lied about the pipes.
They lied about the pipes. Yeah. All right, so I chose three. And the three I chose was the 2007 cooling tower collapse.
It's pretty dramatic.
Completely irrelevant, but very dramatic.
Very dramatic. In one you didn't guess, and this came through my interviews with electric utility officials and other stakeholders, the lack of an agreement between Entergy and the Vermont electric utilities to sell electricity to us ratepayers. And then the third one, of course, is the buried in underground pipes. So those three events illustrate, and I told you and here are the three themes that those illustrate. So we have the two competing storylines, and then we have one other layer here, and that is that the inability of this company to navigate the social and political and policy and economic infrastructure of Vermont. So that's one. The second, the role of the opposition, a highly skilled and increasingly skilled opposition in reframing the conversation using these unfolding events to promote that storyline, that narrative of an aging, deteriorating, untrustworthy, falling apart, out-of-state company. And then the third is this growth of the story from a local story. So for 30-odd years, there has always been opposition, but it's always been centered around the plan. But during this time period between Entergy bought in 2010, the story grew from a local story to a state story, and now it's a national story with national implications. So those are, okay, and so then we have the competing stories. So do you want me to take you through one event and illustrate how those competing stories played out? Or why I felt that event was significant? We'll start with the cooling tower collapse. So actually, the one you mentioned predates the cooling tower collapse. But this happened in August of 2007. Prior to this, but I should say, you know, I'm arguing that for a long time the plant was sort of this quiet thing in southern Vermont, owned by these Vermont electric utilities. When Entergy bought the plant in 2002, there was a concern that we would be giving off control to this out-of-state company, and that all the economic benefit of Vermont utilities owning and operating it would go away. So Entergy agreed to do two things to address those concerns. In 2002, they signed an agreement that they would seek state approval for a relicense. That's very unusual. But they committed to doing that under oath. And they signed an agreement with the Vermont electric utilities to sell electricity at less than what the electric utilities were paid if they had retained ownership of the plant. Yeah, stop me anytime.
Who did they actually sign that agreement with?
The MOU?
Yeah. Was that with the governor or?
It was with the governor's representative, the State Department of Public Service.
Okay.
And then it was presented to the regulatory authority in Vermont that makes decisions. And in testimony under oath, they testified to it.
It was public owned prior to 2002?
Not public owned. It was owned by a consortium of utilities. The majority of the ownership was two Vermont utilities who were based in Vermont, Green Mountain Power and CBPS.
VED had a piece of it at one time, I believe.
BED might have had a small piece, yeah.
Not now, though.
Yeah. But the majority, between those two, they were slightly over 50%.
So it was still privately owned, it was just. local
Yeah.
privately owned.
Yeah, and you can, you know, and over time, those utilities have since been bought or in the process of being bought, so they're not but they, at the time in 2002, they were Vermont-based utilities, even though they were, so, and they're very embedded, enmeshed in the Vermont communities. They, you know, they have lobbyists from up here, they send us all bills every month from those companies. They know the culture of the state. So Entergy made that commitment in 2002, and then they, you know, they started doing some things like they increased power by 20%. They were running out of room to store the radioactive waste in the plant, so they needed permission to store it on site but outside of the facility. They needed legislative approval to do that. Legislature did that, but at the same time, the legislature decided to add themselves as a voice to this decision about the relicense. And that's this law called Act 160, which said basically that before the board issued a new license, before the state issued a new license, they needed an affirmative vote of the Vermont legislature.
When was that?
What was that?
What was the year for that?
2006.
You know, the
yeah.
question, in 2002, somebody had to have an unusual view to even force that MOU, right? I mean, it wasn't happening other places.
Yeah, so you know, one of the other grounding things that I try and say here is that electricity in Vermont is a really public, even though it's a commodity, it's much more than a commodity. It's really been part of how we think and use and talk about things, and it's a very public conversation often about electricity. And so when Entergy bought the plant, there was a whole series of public hearings, and many people raised this idea, this out-of-state company. And so it was an issue of concern to the regulators, and that's why Entergy entered into that agreement.
Okay, but in 2002.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so I'll do one of that, and then I'll just stop and we can talk about these. The cooling tower collapse, 2007. So Entergy's been pushing along, but having success every point. They get permission to store radioactive waste outside the plant. They get permission to increase the plant's output by 20%. They have filed their 20-year license extension with the NRC. Everybody in Vermont, even as late as 2009, expects the plant to win a new license at the Vermont level. Even as late as 2009. But in 2007, one of these cooling towers collapses. And unfortunately for Entergy, somebody there took a photo of it.
So that's inside, I mean, that, you couldn't.
You have to
do
be
that.
inside.
It is.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was someone, it had to be someone who had access to the grounds.
yeah. And, you know, there's various suspicions about who that person is, but it's sort of irrelevant by this point. And they took a high digital. And they somehow, it got into the hands of the opponents, and the opponents immediately circulated to everybody, including all the news media. And now, and even today, every time you see a story about Vermont Yankee, there's the photo again. And so what I argue is this had at least 4 or 5 impacts. One is that it gave a visual symbol to this narrative of an aging, deteriorating plant, right? Suddenly there was a photo. Secondly, it made the story bigger. You know how I was talking about local to state? Media outlets up here who hadn't really been paying much attention to Vermont Yankees suddenly started seeing it as a story. So I'm able to track this by looking at these articles. The Free Press and VPR and Channel 3 suddenly start covering this more. 3, reporters started using the cooling tower collapse as a heuristic, as a shorthand for explaining the plant. And I found that almost 1/3 of the news stories after 2007 referred to this. So we're talking 600-700 stories. 4, Entergy didn't respond in a way that some Vermonters felt was transparent. And it took them, so because it's a non-safety incident, there's certain protocols. As you can imagine, the nuclear power industry is incredibly regulated and incredibly overseen, but if it's non-safety, it fits into a different category. And so, for that reason, Entergy didn't actually inform all the people they might have informed. It took them 2 days before they actually let any members of the public, but meanwhile this photo had been running across the front pages of the newspapers. So there's 3 or 4 reasons why it became, and the last is that the opposition now had a photo. And groups like VPIRG, who became the primary opponent to the plant, used this photo in their materials. So 3 summers in a row, has anyone been canvassed by VPIRG? If you got canvassed by VPIRG, you would have been handed a postcard with this photo on it, asking you to write a letter to your legislator. So that incident kind of made a big difference. And then the second one I talk about is this lack of an agreement to sell electricity into the state. And without that, Entergy didn't have these Vermont constituents willing to fight for them, the Vermont utilities, who are important and powerful forces in Vermont, but they didn't care because there's nothing in it for them. And then the buried pipes is the other one, and less about the factual argument there, but just this whole storyline of a company that was potentially not telling the truth and caught in not telling the truth. And even if you can understand why they said what they did, it just had this total lack of credibility for most Vermonters.
A tech question about the cooling tower thing. I'm wondering if that has anything to do with a 20% power increase.
Some people have argued that, not. I don't really, so from where I sit, it's all just about storytelling and perceptions and so some people have said that the uprate, so forcing the plant to generate 20% more power added stress to various components.
Well, his specific thing was just a heavier fan.
Yeah, but it's not, yeah, so, but I avoid all of those kinds of discussions.
Okay.
I thought they weren't even using the cooling towers because I thought they were using just the river, which is one of the
cooling towers. The cooling towers are to reduce the temperature of the water before it goes back into the river.
I thought they could be using fully the cooling towers, and because of the cost of running cooling towers when they have the river, and they actually have a pretty wide latitude in the temperature they're allowed to raise it,
Right.
that they've been almost using only the river and not the cooling towers because of the energy cost of running cooling towers.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you how I understand it, which is that they have a permit that allows them to empty water at certain temperatures depending on the time of year. So during the winter, you're allowed to put warmer water into but during the summer, so the permit guides what they can do and not do. And based on that is how, and it's in their interest not to use the cooling towers as much as possible because it uses energy that they could be selling on the market.
And what was the date for the incident?
August 2007.
Is there another story in between those stories of the people who live right near there and about related to environmental concerns about health?
Possibly. I think that, you know, by
Or did it
kind of.
not get in the
Right.
particles?
Yeah, you know, I don't know. I mean, I skipped over a couple, so I'm really interested in these two big storylines.
Right.
Economic engine falling apart, untrustworthy company. And some of the ones that Dean or Austin or somebody over there said contributed to this untrustworthy company. There was a huge debate in the legislature about what it would cost to fully decommission the plant. Entergy is on the hook for those costs, but between when they bought the plant in 2002 and today, they haven't put any money into that fund. And initially the fund went up because of the stock market, and then the fund went down because of the stock market. And in 2008, the legislature passed the law requiring Entergy to put more money into it. The governor vetoed it. In 2009, same thing happened. The governor vetoed it again. So that all contributed to this. And then Entergy somewhere, I think it was early 2009, at the same time they are asking for a permit from the state for a license, they filed a request to spin the plant off into a new company that they initially called Spinco. But changed the name.
Freudian company.
That would be this, they would own just their merchant power. So they have 5 reactors that are just for profit, you know, selling into wholesale markets. Anyway, it would own just those, but to borrow the money to buy them from Entergy, and its bond, the value of the company was junk bond status. So they had to borrow $4+ billion to buy these plants from Entergy, this new company that they were trying to create. And that made everybody really skeptical too, because the only assets the new company would have would be these 5 very old nuclear reactors. Yeah.
So it seems to me, I mean, obviously what you're saying is that you're using the media to, you know, the information that you're getting from the media to kind of draw conclusions on how maybe some legislation worked or went. So is that close so far?
Yeah, it's less, I can't do the causal thing.
Okay.
All I can try and do is trace the change in stories over time.
So, okay, so you're not drawing conclusions. So I guess my question is, you're saying this postcard that VPERG had,
Right.
or that, you know, this photo had an
Right.
impact, it's one of your 3
Right.
major impacts. So do you think the media blew it out of proportion? That it wasn't, you know, this giant, oh my God, what a nightmare this place is? Or do you think it got valid coverage, or was it over exploited? Is that too much of an opinion question?
It's just that, you know, I hate to be like the boring researcher, but I can't really, the media to me is not really, it's too amorphous a concept. So stories are social constructions, and they're based on a whole series of factors, like the ability of opponents to make that story on the front page, or the reporter's relationships, or the pressures of the editor to get a story done. All these things are happening, and all I can do is try and show over time these changes. And I'll give you 2 examples, and I know I'm not answering this question that well.
No, it's fine.
And so, you know, in interviews with the opposition, they told me some of their strategies. So and they were, by 2008, 2009, the opposition groups were starting to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight and hire their own professional campaign people, which is nothing compared to what Entergy spent. I mean, many of you have seen the ads probably. But at any rate, they were doing messaging and strategizing, and one of their strategies was, instead of, what do you think is more attractive? Shut down Vermont Yankee or retire as scheduled? So that was their strategy, and they tried to reframe it every chance they get. And then what I could do by looking at the media and building these dictionaries that allows you to do this analysis, I could show that over time the conversation started to become, and even the reporters started picking up on this phraseology, as expected and as scheduled. and as it was supposed to happen. Because what the opposition was trying to do was make the ending of the plant a couple days ago the status quo. So the unusual thing was to keep it running. And then one other, just like that, that is really, you see it today if you listen to anybody of the opposition, including the governor, a couple days ago on VPR. They reframed Entergy every chance they could get as an out-of-state company. So every time they used the word Entergy, they would put Louisiana. Or sometimes they couldn't remember what state it was from, so they would say Mississippi. Or non-Vermont, or out-of-state, or New Orleans-based. And so again, I could sort of see over time that you didn't see that at all 2003, 2004, 2005, and suddenly in 2008 you started seeing every time Entergy was mentioned by one of these groups, it would be Entergy Louisiana. You know, and as Vermonters, it's probably one of the worst. Oh, wait, we're at the gun. Louisiana roots here, right?
Good point.
Maybe. But anyway, in Vermont, I don't know if there's something, but that was a very clever tactic and you started seeing it.
Were there any non-opposition groups outside of Entergy?
Support groups.
Support groups.
Yeah, they have an organization called the Vermont Energy Partnership, which
Is that the Ethan Allen Institute?
probably like the Ethan Allen Institute, and if I had, more time and was a better journalist, I could probably trace through their funding that they really are. But every time, Entergy doesn't speak publicly anymore. Or does it infrequently, so for example, all those op-eds in the Free Press, the pro ones are from this group called Vermont Energy Partnership. But that's very standard, to have your front group.
Could you go over the reason why Vermont sold it to them in the first place again?
Yeah, these Vermont utilities just did not feel capable, on one hand, of running a nuclear power plant. After 9/11, all sorts of new rules started coming down about managing.
Right.
So, so amaze you guys, but when I was a kid in Putney, we would get tours of the nuclear power plant, and the sheriff, the county sheriff, and if you know county sheriffs in Vermont, it's not always the most professional job. Anyway, his side job was managing the security at Vermont Yankee. And you could drive into the parking lot and then go up and knock on the front door.
Oh, okay.
I was really lucky. They gave me a tour, so I got a chance to see what it's like now. And I think I went through 5 lines of defense, and it took 6 months for for me to be vetted. And there was things like putting your hand on and breathing into stuff, and so those days are different. And the Vermont utilities knew that was coming. They were also really worried about decommissioning costs because the ratepayers in Vermont were on the hook for that. And increasingly that was, they didn't know if they would be able to run it for 20 years. So say that could have happened in 2002, they would have been on the hook for, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And third of all, because of deregulation, increasingly there was these companies that specialized in managing power plants and nuclear reactors. I mean, Entergy was such a company. They're the second largest nuclear power plant manager in the country. They have something like 14 or 15 reactors. So it was felt like this is a good thing to turn over, except for like Conservation Law Foundation and a couple of the opposition groups were like, we're losing control. We're giving out of control. And that's why Entergy agreed, which some people are still amazed at today, to seek state approval in this relicensing process.
So I'm waiting for you to write the other book about the 40 years before 2000 and whatever. That was the story about why the public got to accept something as stupid as nuclear power in the first place. I mean, it doesn't make economic sense, it doesn't make safety sense as well. I mean, for all the reasons that, so there's no reality, everything's constructed, but I would argue that for most Americans, whatever the value system, if all that stuff was presented in as objective way as possible, if that's could be possible, economic reasons, safety reasons, all this stuff, the nuclear power, it's subsidized, it has these decommissioning costs that cost you everything, and then you don't even know what they are. most rational people hearing that story would say, that's crazy, but we loved it, you know? There's a whole book before, and how did we get to love nuclear power plants? In the beginning, to actually build all of them.
I got,
You may not be old enough to answer that question.
just so you know, I have my whole chapter 2, which is 18 odd pages, is the history of it, so there you go.
Okay. I apologize, I didn't read your book.
I'm kidding, because it should be like this, easily. And I was, I went and looked at some of the people who've written those books. There are some really great ones. In fact, there's a historian for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission named Sam Hand. I think his name is Sam. Anyway, he's a critic or whatever. He's written some really, really good books. He's wrote one on 3 Mile Island. But interestingly enough, there was a debate in Vermont. We were at a crossroads between going the nuclear road or going the hydro road.
Mm-hmm.
And the Vermont utilities really wanted the nuclear road because everyone else was doing it in a way. In the late 60s, early 70s, that was the thing to do if you were an electric utility. Own your own, build your own nuclear power plant. Others, do you have a question?
He was first.
I'm sort of curious as to what the larger point or lesson to be drawn from is that media, these two narratives over time, and in the sense that the differing narratives, and one narrative came to dominate the other, that narrative dominated voter sentiment, and then that influenced the politicians in the legislature, or that the media was reflecting, it's always the tension, is the media driving the behavior of the voter, or is voter behavior driving media coverage, and there's an interaction between the two. They sort of can feed off each other in circles.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to get at is it that the media then influences that public debate and then that political decision, or what's a lesson that you draw from this if you were looking at voter sentiment on greenhouse gas emissions and whatever? What role can the media play in that? Is it
Right.
how do you draw from this and extrapolate to some of the larger?
Well, I'd be really interested to see what people think when they read it, but I try and just tell the story of the story, and let kind of people, one sub though, I think that relates to what you're asking me, is that what if Entergy had better PR? What if they had been better in communications? Could they have won this battle? And I let people draw their own conclusions, but I personally, I think that there's something in how they approach Vermont and how nuclear power people think that the best PR in the world wouldn't have changed the outcome here. There's something about Vermont and maybe other places where we demand a certain amount of transparency and a certain amount of participation and a certain amount of engagement, and that's reflected in how the news media covered this story over time. And after a while, there was something in how Entergy presented itself that just wasn't believable, and they were increasingly isolated. They had no friends, important friends like business leaders. So in these struggles with corporations and citizen activists, the media is kind of the in-between, and the media is this place where people are fighting out this battle, and that's all I'm trying to do is just tell the story through that. Yeah.
Do you think the media had a role in the actual court decision? Because it did seem like the decision was kind of based on the fact that the politicians were talking about safety issues in making a decision, and that's why they said they couldn't make the decision, is that they were like taking authority from NRC. So I'm curious, because a lot of that stuff was in the media. I mean, the politicians were, being recorded and saying certain things and how they were weighing the decision. Can you speak at all to that? Or?
No, I don't think so, because Entergy had the resources to actually go and get all the audio transcripts, all the audio tapes of all the legislative sessions that in any way talked about any bill related to Vermont Yankee. And it's pretty stunning if you look at what they did, because, and they took all those audio tapes and then they took out the snippets where legislators were talking about safety.
Yeah.
And then they said to the judge, this whole thing is a pretext for safety. You know, and there's some damning statements if you think that that's important. There's a legislator that said, oh, we can't use the word safety, let's change it to reliability. And then the actual bill that emerged was the reliability bill. But what the state is arguing and others is that the sausage-making process of making laws is really, you know, it's people thinking out loud, it's not everybody involved, and to hold all those people accountable is not really a good way to think about you know, how you interpret these laws. What you should look at is what the legislature passed, the actual law. And Act 160 says nothing about safety.
Right.
And in fact, Entergy even quoted a witness. So like Joe Citizen shows up in the hearing, and Entergy is using that Joe Citizen's comments as evidence that this legislature was really secretly all about safety. And they had a very, very good lawyer, you know, the best lawyer money can buy, on the short list for the next seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. And she did a 4.5-hour close where she would she went, you know, had a PowerPoint where she went audio of these legislative comments. And if you read the judge's decision, 104 odd pages, 75 pages of it is like Entergy's arguments repeated.
Wow.
So Bill Sorrell was at this event I did a couple nights ago, and he's, you know, this time they are hiring a hotshot lawyer rather than rely on the state people. So they've gone down to Washington and hired their own hotshot lawyer. So this thing is going to get very, very expensive. But
What was the decision of the state regulatory board before?
they haven't issued a decision yet. So remember, under Act 160, they couldn't issue a permit until the legislature voted affirmatively.
Okay, so I thought it was the other way around. The legislator was voting after.
But here's the interesting thing. No vote of the legislature would also mean they couldn't issue a permit.
Is the permit the same as the certificate
Yeah.
of public?
Yeah,
good or
sorry,
bad?
yeah. So no vote would have been the same, and that's what some legislators wanted to do, but Peter Shumlin and the opposition groups were like, this is the time to strike. You know, let's make a really strong statement, and they did, a 26-4 vote. Yeah.
Did the opposition have an alternative narrative to the economic narrative? About some alternative energy vision?
They tried that a little bit, and then their polling and messaging showed them that any conversation in that field was in Entergy's field. Anytime you raise the idea of jobs or economics, suddenly you're over here in this, and what they had to do was reframe it. So they had to make it about untrust, and they had to make it about out of state, and they had to make it about aging and deteriorating and falling apart. If they had a conversation about jobs, they lost. But that was their initial idea. It was interesting. I interviewed them. They were going to do this like Vermont brand thing, and then lost.
I think it's interesting that how this story might compare to the larger national story, because I think this story is kind of replicated in a nationally. The whole thing of how are we gonna get rid of this waste? Are we gonna, you know, take it to Yucca Mountain in trucks and all that? What strikes me is there is no strategy. And could it be that Vermont, how they're treating us by saying, no, you have to keep it, could that be part of their strategy of things to come? Because many of these are coming of age now where there have to be decisions in different states. And so maybe they're taking a stand here in Vermont and saying, we can't allow this to happen in Vermont because if they get rid of it, then everybody's gonna get rid of it.
That's an interesting point, because Entergy is actually also has the Indian Point, the 2 reactors at Indian Point are being contested in New York State, and Pilgrim in Massachusetts is another one of their plants that's also being contested. Austin.
I'm wondering about the role of the NRC in all this. They issued their
License, yes.
license to continue. What was it, like last November?
April
or something?
2011.
Oh, it's April. Okay.
The day after Fukushima.
Yeah, amazing. And so I just saw this great film. You've probably seen it called The Atomic States of America.
No.
Oh, you haven't seen that? Oh, you should definitely see it. It's a very good documentary on nuclear power. I think it just came out. But one of the things they talked about in there, if I recall correctly, is that basically the NRC has essentially never turned down a license, it's never revoked, I mean, it's basically this rubber stamp. And so I'm wondering, you know, has anyone looked at that? Is there really any basis for us to trust these NRC licensing decisions, or are they really just rubber stamps?
Yeah.
And do policy level decisions like Obama's sort of slight embrace of nuclear power in response to the, his opposition during the McCain campaign,
Right.
does that maybe play into it, or where does the NRC come into all this?
Yeah, so, exactly. So the NRC used to be called the Atomic Energy Commission, 1954. They were seen as, at the time, a huge advocate for nuclear power. They got a new name, and for a little while there in the
George
Carter-
Bush changed it to the nuclear.
Right. And then there's a very good political science professor who wrote about this, Duffy, and I corresponded with him and I said, has anyone done sort of the academic stuff about the relicensing? He's like, no, there's a niche there. You know, I don't quite, that could be future research, but here's what happened. The nuclear industry it's been impossible to permit a new plant. So the last plant was 1978-ish.
Yeah.
You know.
Illinois.
So it's been, and now this thing in Georgia may be on its way to being permitted, so how does the industry survive? They have all these plants built in the 70s, basically. The only way to survive, and they all were permitted initially for 40 years. The only way to survive is to extend the licenses 20 years. So they started looking at that in, I think it was the late 80s. I write about this, that's why I know a little bit about it. And they needed a process, because they didn't have a way to do relicensing. So they developed a process, and they had two test cases. One was Yankee Row, which is in Massachusetts, and another was in Michigan. And when Yankee Row got into it, the various issues came up, and it wasn't able to get through the relicensing process. So the NRC redid how they were going to do the application process in response to these two pilots. And the one in Michigan did eventually get permitted, but Yankee Row shut down. And it didn't shut, the ones that have shut down, like Maine Yankee also, it's not that they were closed by the NRC, it's that to meet the costs of meeting the NRC regulations became too much. And in both those cases, Massachusetts and Maine, they were owned by these small regional utilities rather than these merchant power producers. So, to survive, you have to get relicensed. So, since then, since we've redone the rules, 71 nuclear power plants have gotten all the way through. 71 nuclear power plants have received their additional 20-year licenses. There's 31, there's 104 in the country, there's 31 now. There's 14 or 15 in play before the NRC, and another 15 or 16 expected. And the next conversation, life beyond 60.
Yeah. You should see this film because they actually talk about some of the requirements of the NRC relicensing, and then they actually go around to some plants and they find, I mean, they're just flagrant violation of what's supposed to be done to meet their relicensing requirements. So it's just meaningless thing. Yeah.
But this one is the longest it ever took, I think. Actually, Pilgrim is still in at something like 6 years, but this was over. They applied in 2008, I guess. Where are we? Well, maybe 4 years to do it. Yeah. And remember, so I should just say one last thing if you guys haven't heard this part of the story. So the Senate rejects it February 2010. April 2011, the NRC issues the license. Or maybe it's March.
Yeah,
It's March. Yeah. A month later, Entergy sues the state of Vermont. We have our license from the NRC.
I think this is beyond the scope of what you did, but I've been here 5.5 years now, and the other picture on your cover is Shumlin.
Right.
Shumlin led that fight when he was in the Senate, wasn't the governor, but
Right.
that was part of his strategy, I suppose. But it worked so well, maybe I've been snookered, but it seems like he had a lot of extreme intestinal fortitude to
Right.
do that.
Right.
Where did that come from? I mean, why did it happen that way with an extreme
Right.
statement? As you said, they didn't even have to vote at all.
Right.
But he led a vote which was decisive. Where did that come from?
Well, I can tell you what the people I interviewed said. So Shumlin's from Windham County, from Putney actually. Shumlin and I were in elementary school together years ago. Even then, I knew he was going to be governor. No. So the opponents, the opposition in 2008 and 2009, they're focused on the House. The House is where there's 150 legislators, grassroots groups. They got a much better chance at influencing these guys. They only represent 5,000 people. A few letters really makes a difference, right? In the late summer of 2009, Shumlin called up Beeper and said, let's focus on the Senate instead, right? Senate has only 30 people, but it's more pro-business. It's generally seen that way. Districts are much bigger, people are harder to influence, and the grassroots groups were like, I don't know, we've got this whole thing going, we got these vote counts, you know, we're like at 76 and we need 84, and Shumlin's like, yeah, but I can deliver. I can make it happen. And that's what they needed. So in the House, you had Shap Smith, the speaker, and he never made that commitment. And in these really contested battles, you need a leader who's going to do the kind of arm twisting that will deliver the vote in the end. And he told them that he would. And why did he have that fortitude? Or why? He's very familiar with the issue. Some people have said he was thinking about governor. To win a primary in a place like Vermont, you need really strong constituents on the left. The two people that stood with him when he announced that he was running for governor was David Blitterstorff, who's a leading opponent and funder of anti-nuclear causes in Vermont, and Beth Robinson, who's the leading supporter of gay marriage. Shumlin delivered in the eyes of those constituencies. He was the guy who delivered on both of those issues. He won the primary by 100. Do you guys remember? I think I write about it, but I think it might have been 200 votes.
Yeah, it was some 200.
200 votes he won the Democratic primary by. Anyway, you can say whatever you want, but it clearly, and he used his work on this in the primary. Like, I'm a primary voter, I don't know if any of you guys are, but I got multiple postcards from him with this photo on the front saying, I delivered. Sorry to bring it back to politics.
No, I asked.
Any other, Steve?
Yeah, thinking about some of the connections to other issues and really enjoying the story of the story. I think that's so important to tell that and to analyze it in the way that you have. And the atomic age, Walt Disney, one of the most compelling storytellers in the last 50 years, even had that book that you mentioned there, Our Friend the Atom, right? What kind of lessons would you apply to the issues of things like biodiversity loss or land use or ecosystem service change that are important these days?
And that's the same question you were asking.
Yeah,
me.
similar
No,
question,
and I'm not,
yeah.
my head is just not there. Like, how do you use the lessons from this and doing better on the fights of things we care about?
Yeah, and especially things that don't have really amazing dynamic visuals like this. I mean,
Right.
what's the visual for like greenhouse gas emissions?
Well,
or
I mean, this
ecosystem
made it
services,
local, right? This all of a sudden made a climate issue in a way, or an environmental issue, all of a sudden very, very real to people here.
Yeah, visually.
Whereas most global climate change in America isn't perceived locally. It's perceived, well, some glaciers are melting somewhere. Okay, maybe Katrina was related, and maybe Hurricane and Tropical Storm Irene maybe was linked, but it isn't made local. This was made it all of a sudden very, very personal.
Yeah.
And how you take those larger images and make them personal.
Yeah, I wonder. And anybody who has thoughts on that?
Does Entergy own power outside of their nuclear power?
They do, actually, yeah. I mean, they have, and they also are a retail electric utility in the South with millions and millions of customers.
Seems like maybe one key lesson here is that reframing in terms of what's expected and what's normal.
Right.
So when they made that shift from shut down Vermont Yankee to it's expected that its license expires, it will end, it will close then. And I think that reminds me of something that Bill McKibben said when he was here. The reason he asked people to wear suits and dresses to the Keystone XL pipeline protests was to show that we're not the radicals
Right.
in this situation. And
Right,
it's like reframing
right.
what is normal, what's expected, and what it means to be radical.
Right. Yeah, people are writing about that, you guys know that, they're trying to strategize, and academics also. You know, really, there's a whole center where they're, maybe Dean knows about this, where they're trying to think about messaging strategies on these things, but I don't know. You know, really, but the kind of research I like to do is get in-depth as much as possible and tell a story, and people take the meaning that they want. By the way, autographed copies, $12. You can buy them online for less.
But who gets the money?
So all the money goes to the Center for Research on Vermont.
Oh, okay.
So that's the way I did it. So yeah. Either way, actually, more money if you buy it from us goes to the center. So Amazon takes their chunk, right, Austin?
I don't know, I haven't seen a penny yet.
You're probably gonna owe them money.
Austin, I bought yours on Amazon.
Yeah, I buy yours too.
I'm interested, how many interviews did you do total?
35, about 35. Yeah, that was a lot of work. But I had a fun summer.